The autumn of 1944 painted the forest of Virginia in shades of amber and gold, but Thomas Whitmore saw only gray. At 63 years old, he walked with a limp that told stories his mouth refused to share. The wooden staff in his right hand wasn't just for balance. It was a reminder of everything he'd lost. The small town of Millbrook had forgotten what war meant. Young men shipped off to Europe with drums and fanfare, but Thomas stayed behind. Too old, they said. Too broken. The Great War had taken his leg below the knee, and though he'd learned to walk again with a prosthetic, the town saw him as a relic. A museum piece. Someone to pity during Sunday services and ignore the rest of the week. Thomas lived alone in a cabin at the edge of Blackwood Forest, 3 miles from town. His wife Margaret had died 5 years prior, leaving him with nothing but silence and memories. He chopped wood, tended a small garden, and occasionally walked into town for supplies. People nodded politely. Children stared at his limp. Nobody asked his opinion about the war. But Thomas read every newspaper he could find. He studied maps. He understood tactics better than most men half his age. The problem was that nobody wanted to hear it. When he tried to offer advice at the town hall meeting about civil defense, Mayor Hutchins had smiled condescendingly and said, "Thank you for your service, Mr. Whitmore, but we have younger men handling security now." Younger men like Deputy Frank Morrison, 28, who'd failed the physical for overseas duty due to flat feet. Frank wore his badge like a Medal of Honor and treated Thomas like a doddering grandfather. The irony wasn't lost on the old soldier. Everything changed on a cold October morning when Thomas heard the news on his crackling radio. German POWs had escaped from Camp Greenbrier, 40 miles north. 6 men. Dangerous. Armed. The announcer's voice carried urgency that made Thomas's pulse quicken for the first time in years. He grabbed his staff and walked to the edge of his property. Blackwood Forest stretched endlessly before him. Dense. Perfect for hiding. Perfect for ambush. Thomas knew every trail, every ravine, every natural shelter. He'd hunted these woods for 40 years. By noon, military vehicles rolled through Millbrook. Soldiers set up roadblocks. The town buzzed with nervous energy. Thomas walked to the general store where a crowd had gathered around Sheriff Patterson, who stood on the steps making announcements. "These men are trained soldiers," Patterson said. "Stay in your homes. Lock your doors. Let the professionals handle this." Thomas raised his hand. "Sheriff, I know these woods better than anyone. I can help search." Patterson's expression softened with pity. "Tom, we appreciate the offer, but this requires men who can move fast. Maybe you could keep an eye on things here in town." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not cruel exactly, just dismissive. Thomas felt heat rise to his face. He gripped his staff tighter and turned away. Frank Morrison called after him, "Don't worry, old-timer. We'll catch them before supper time." Thomas walked home in silence. The word old-timer echoed in his head with each step. He'd commanded a platoon at Belowwood. He'd held a trench for 3 days against impossible odds. He'd earned a Purple Heart and a Silver Star. But here now he was just an old man with a walking stick. That evening, as darkness fell, Thomas sat on his porch cleaning his old service rifle. He kept it maintained out of habit, not expectation. The weapon was nearly as old as he was, but it still worked perfectly. Muscle memory took over as he checked the bolt, the barrel, the sight. A sound stopped him cold. Voices. German voices. Faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees beyond his property line. Thomas's heart hammered. He extinguished his lamp and moved to the window. Through the darkness he saw shadows moving. 6 figures, cautious, staying low. They were heading toward the ravine that led to the river crossing. Smart. That route would take them past town defenses entirely. He had 2 choices. Walk 3 miles to town to alert the sheriff. By then, the prisoners would be gone. Or handle it himself. Thomas looked at his rifle, at his staff, at the forest he knew better than his own heartbeat. The old soldier smiled for the first time in months. He stepped into the night. Thomas moved through the forest like a ghost. His prosthetic leg made noise, so he used his staff to distribute weight. stepping carefully on moss-covered stones and soft earth. The Germans were 200 yards ahead, moving in formation. Professional, disciplined. These weren't ordinary soldiers. He recognized their pattern immediately. A triangle formation with a point man. They communicated with hand signals. Even in escape, they maintained military precision. Thomas felt a grudging respect. These men were dangerous. The ravine narrowed ahead. Thomas knew exactly where they were going. Miller's Crossing, where the river was shallow enough to ford. From there, they could reach the railroad tracks and disappear into the countryside. The search parties were concentrated north and east. Nobody was watching the western route. Thomas had maybe 20 minutes before they reached the crossing. One man with a rifle against 6 trained soldiers. The arithmetic was brutal. He needed an advantage. His mind raced through possibilities. Then he remembered something from his days in France. Deception. Misdirection. Make the enemy believe they face overwhelming force. He circled wide, moving parallel to their route. His legs screamed with each step, but adrenaline dulled the pain. When he reached a game trail that intersected their path, he stopped and studied the soft ground. Using his staff, Thomas began creating footprints. He pressed the end into the mud at angles, creating impressions that looked like boot prints. Then he moved 15 feet and repeated the process. Then again, and again. He worked quickly, creating a trail that suggested a patrol of 5 or 6 men moving perpendicular to the German route. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold. His hands shook, but the pattern emerged. To an observer, it looked like an American patrol had just passed through, heading to cut them off. Thomas added details. He broke branches at chest height, scraped bark from a tree, left a cigarette but near a boulder. Every element told a story of soldiers moving hastily through the woods. Then he heard voices getting closer. The Germans were approaching. Thomas melted into the shadows behind a fallen oak, 50 yards from his fabricated trail. His rifle was ready, but he prayed he wouldn't need it. The point man appeared first. Young, maybe 25. He raised his fist and the formation stopped. He'd seen the tracks. Rapid German followed. Thomas understood enough from his war days. The point man was reporting fresh American footprints. Multiple soldiers. Recent. Very recent. The leader moved forward. Older. Harder. An officer, Thomas guessed. He knelt and examined the tracks, running his fingers through the impressions. Thomas held his breath. Would the deception hold? The officer stood and gave orders. Sharp. Decisive. The formation shifted. They were turning back, seeking a different route. It was working. Then Thomas's prosthetic leg slipped on wet leaves. The sound was barely audible. A scrape of wood against stone. But in the silence of the forest, it might as well have been a gunshot. The German officer's head snapped toward Thomas's position. He barked an order. 2 soldiers immediately broke formation, weapons raised, moving toward the fallen oak. Thomas pressed himself flat against the earth. His heart hammered so hard he thought they might hear it. He had seconds to decide. Stay hidden and hope they passed. Or act. The first soldier rounded the oak, rifle sweeping the darkness. Thomas drove his staff upward with both hands, catching the man under the chin. The German staggered backward, and Thomas was already moving, using the momentum to roll right. A shot cracked through the air, splintering bark where his head had been. Thomas came up on one knee, rifle raised. He fired once. The muzzle flash illuminated everything for a split second. The second soldier dropped. Chaos erupted, shouting in German. More shots. Thomas scrambled behind a thick maple as bullets chewed into the trunk. He was breathing hard, his leg throbbing with white-hot pain. This wasn't the plan. This was supposed to be quiet. But something had changed. The Germans weren't advancing. They were retreating. Fast. Panicked voices echoed through the trees, growing fainter. Thomas waited 5 full minutes before moving. When he finally looked, the forest was empty. The soldier he'd hit with his staff was gone. They'd carried him. The second man lay motionless in the leaves. Thomas approached carefully, rifle ready. The soldier was young. Too young. Not dead, but unconscious, bleeding from a shoulder wound. Thomas's shot had been off-center, thank God. He wasn't a killer. Not anymore. He checked the soldier's pulse. Steady. Then Thomas did something that surprised even himself. He tore strips from his own shirt and bandaged the wound. Field medicine from another lifetime. His hands remembered what his mind had tried to forget. If you're watching this story and feeling that same fire Thomas felt, that urge to prove yourself when everyone counts you out, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with determination. And this old soldier's fight is just getting started. Thomas fashioned a travois from branches and his jacket, then began dragging the wounded German toward town. Every step was agony. His prosthetic leg wasn't designed for this. But he moved with purpose, stopping every 100 yards to rest and check his surroundings. The other 5 Germans were still out there, but now they thought they were facing a full patrol. Thomas had bought time, maybe saved lives. As dawn began breaking through the trees, Thomas finally saw the lights of Millbrook in the distance. He was exhausted, bleeding from a dozen scrapes. His leg was barely functioning, but he was smiling. Thomas dragged the travois into Main Street just as the sun crested the horizon. Sheriff Patterson was organizing search teams outside his office. 30 men, rifles in hand, preparing to sweep the northern woods. The sheriff saw Thomas first. His mouth fell open, then everyone turned. Tom? What in God's name? Thomas released the travois handles. His legs nearly gave out. Deputy Morrison rushed forward and caught him before he fell. One of the escaped prisoners, Thomas said, his voice hoarse. Wounded. Needs medical attention. The other 5 are in Blackwood Forest, heading away from Miller's Crossing. I turned them back. How did you? Patterson started, then stopped. He looked at the wounded German, at Thomas's makeshift bandages, at the old man's exhausted face. You engaged 6 armed men? Alone? I used their training against them, made them think they were walking into an ambush, created false tracks with my staff. They changed course. The crowd had gone silent. Morrison helped Thomas to a bench. Someone brought water. A doctor was already examining the German prisoner. Patterson knelt beside Thomas. Show me exactly where they were headed, where you redirected them. Thomas pulled out a crumpled map from his pocket. He'd marked everything. The German position, the fake trail, the likely new routes they'd take. His hand shook as he pointed, but his tactical mind was sharp as ever. Patterson studied the map, then looked at his deputy. Frank, take teams here, here, and here. Set up observation posts. Don't engage until you have overwhelming force. He turned to Thomas. This is good work. Professional work. Within an hour, Patterson's men had spotted the Germans exactly where Thomas predicted. The escaped prisoners were exhausted, disoriented, and convinced they were surrounded by a massive American force. They surrendered without a shot fired. When the military police arrived from Camp Greenbrier, the commanding officer wanted a full debrief. Thomas walked him through everything. The officer, a captain named Reynolds, listened with growing respect. Mr. Whitmore, you potentially saved lives today, both American and German. That took skill and restraint. He paused. I see from your records you served at Belleauwood, Silver Star recipient. That was a long time ago, Thomas said quietly. Reynolds shook his head. A soldier doesn't stop being a soldier just because he gets older. He extended his hand. Thank you for your service. Then and now. The town gathered in the square that evening. Mayor Hutchins stood on the same steps where Thomas had been dismissed just yesterday. The speech was awkward, full of apologies disguised as praise. But Thomas barely heard it. He was watching the faces in the crowd. The young men who'd laughed. The deputy who'd called him old-timer. They looked at him differently now. Respect. That's what he saw. Finally, the days following the capture brought changes Thomas never expected. The story spread beyond Millbrook. A newspaper reporter from Richmond drove up to interview him. Then another from Washington. The headline in the Virginia Gazette read, Wounded veteran outsmarts Nazi escapees with walking stick. Thomas hated the attention. He gave brief interviews, deflecting praise, insisting he'd simply done what needed doing. But the town wouldn't let it fade. The American Legion Post invited him to speak. The high school asked him to talk to students about tactics and strategy. Deputy Morrison showed up at Thomas's cabin one crisp November morning. He carried a box and looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitmore, I owe you an apology," Morrison said, not meeting his eyes. "I treated you like you were useless, like your experience didn't matter. I was wrong." Thomas leaned on his staff, studying the younger man. "You weren't wrong to trust younger legs, Frank. You were wrong to think that's all that matters in a fight." Morrison nodded slowly. "Captain Reynolds asked if you'd be willing to consult on civil defense planning. Help train volunteers in woodland tactics." He opened the box, revealing a radio transmitter. "They want to set up a communication network. Spotters in the forest. You'd coordinate." For the first time in years, Thomas felt purpose stirring in his chest. "I'm 63 years old, Frank. And you outmaneuvered 6 trained soldiers half your age." Morrison finally met his gaze. "We need what's in your head, sir. The war isn't over. There could be more escapes, more threats. We need someone who understands how the enemy thinks." Thomas took the radio, feeling its weight. Solid. Real. "When do we start?" Over the following weeks, Thomas transformed Millbrook's defense strategy. He identified vulnerable points, established patrol routes, trained volunteers in observation and reporting. He taught them what he'd learned in France: how to read tracks, how to move silently, how to think 3 steps ahead. Sheriff Patterson made him an official civil defense consultant. No badge, no gun, just authority born from competence. The young men who'd dismissed him now took notes during his briefings. They called him Sir without irony. One evening in December, Thomas stood on his porch watching snow begin to fall. Inside, his radio crackled with check-ins from patrol posts throughout Blackwood Forest. His network, his system, working. Car pulled up. Captain Reynolds stepped out, carrying a wooden case. "Mr. Whitmore, I wanted to deliver this personally." Reynolds opened the case, revealing a medal. "The Distinguished Service Cross. For your actions in October. Extraordinary heroism in the face of armed enemy combatants." Thomas stared at the medal. Margaret would have been proud. That thought brought tears he didn't try to hide. "You reminded a lot of people what service really means," Reynolds said quietly. "Age doesn't retire courage." Thomas accepted the medal with trembling hands. He'd spent 5 years feeling invisible, forgotten. But standing there in the falling snow, radio voices crackling behind him, he finally felt seen again. 3 years later, spring 1947, Thomas Whitmore stood in front of 40 young men at the newly established Millbrook Veterans Training Center. At 66, his hair had gone completely white, but his posture was straight, his voice strong. The wooden staff leaned against the wall. He rarely needed it anymore. Purpose, it seemed, was better medicine than sympathy. The war had ended. Boys had come home, some whole, some broken. Thomas recognized that look in their eyes, the one he'd carried for decades, the feeling of being displaced, unnecessary, forgotten. "Gentlemen," he began, his gaze sweeping the room, "the world thinks it's done with you, that you've served your purpose, that it's time to step aside and let others take over." He picked up his staff, running his fingers along the worn wood. 3 years ago, 6 German soldiers escaped 40 miles from here. I was told I was too old to help, too broken, just an old man with a walking stick. He smiled. That walking stick helped me create false footprints that convinced trained soldiers they were outnumbered. It helped me save lives without taking them unnecessarily. The young veterans listened, some leaning forward. "Your trauma, your injuries, your experiences. They're not handicaps. They're tools. Different tools than you had before, maybe, but tools nonetheless. The question isn't whether you can still serve. It's how." After the class, a young corporal approached. He'd lost his right arm at Normandy. "Mr. Whitmore, I used to be a carpenter. I don't know what I am now." Thomas clasped his shoulder. You're a carpenter who thinks differently about balance and leverage. Come back tomorrow. We'll figure it out together. That evening, Thomas walked through town. The Veterans Center was his pride. Funded by donations after his story went national. A place where returning soldiers learned new skills, found purpose, rebuilt lives. He stopped at Margaret's grave, placing fresh flowers on the headstone. I found my way back. Maggie, he whispered. Took me long enough. Sheriff Patterson pulled up in his cruiser. Tom, got a minute? There's a situation up at Camp Greenbrier. Security consultation. They specifically asked for you. Thomas smiled. Still keeping me busy. Are they? You created a whole new field, Tom. Adaptive tactics. Using limitation as innovation. Half the military bases on the East Coast want to learn your methods. As they drove north, Thomas watched the familiar forests pass by. The same trees that had witnessed his redemption. He thought about that October night. How close he'd come to remaining invisible forever. If you've watched this story all the way to the end, thank you. Really. Thomas's journey reminds us that being underestimated isn't the end. It's sometimes the beginning. If this story moved you, hit that like button, leave a comment about a time you proved someone wrong, and subscribe for more incredible true stories of courage and redemption. Your support means everything. Thomas Whitmore never stopped serving. He just learned to serve differently, and that made all the difference.